We heard you bought this luxury cabin in Aspen. We're moving in to let bygones be bygones. My daughter-in-law, Sloane, snapped, shoving her heavy designer suitcases through the front door like she already owned the place. I'm Cora Vance, at 65 years old. I just smiled and stepped aside to let them in. But the second they stepped into the great room and saw what was waiting for them, all the color drained from their faces. My son, Holden, trailed behind Sloane, dragging more luggage, his eyes glued to the floor. I hadn't heard a peep from them in 3 years. Funny how that silence started right after I sold the restaurant empire I'd spent 4 decades building. I knew exactly why they were here. The scent of money has a way of attracting folks who've never wanted to work for a dime of it. But my Aspen getaway wasn't the winter wonderland they'd pictured. When Sloane looked up, expecting to see a magazine-cover living room with plush leather sectionals and a roaring fireplace, she was met with a full-blown industrial workspace. The entire first floor minus my private bedroom and the kitchen was completely stripped of furniture. Instead, the space was swallowed up by massive stainless steel prep tables, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, blinding UV grow lights, and a complex irrigation system humming quietly in the background. I had converted 90% of the house into a commercial hydroponic orchid nursery. "What on earth is this?" Sloane whispered, dropping the handle of her Louis Vuitton bag. "Where's the furniture? Where are we supposed to sleep?" I pointed to a tight corner wedged between stacks of organic potting soil, where a stiff, tiny love seat sat. "Since you didn't give me a heads up you were coming, I haven't set up the guest quarters," I said smoothly, pulling my shawl a little tighter around my shoulders. "That sofa pulls out into a twin bed. Just watch your step around the irrigation hoses if you get up in the middle of the night." Holden blinked, totally bewildered. "Mom, we thought you'd have spare bedrooms." "The plants need their space." "Holden," I replied, turning toward my private hallway. "Make yourselves at home." As I locked the door to my wing, I heard Sloane let out her first exasperated sigh. I knew this was just the beginning, but my house meant my rules, and they were about to get a crash course in both. That first night was a quiet kind of theater. From the comfort of my master suite, complete with radiant floor heating and an incredibly cozy, warm bed, I could hear Sloane's muffled groans as she tried to get comfortable on that rigid, pull-out couch. I was up by 6 the next morning. It was hovering around 26 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I brewed my coffee in peace and took a seat at the kitchen island. Sloane eventually shuffled in, wrapped like a burrito in 3 blankets, visibly shivering. Her lips tinged blue. "Cora, the thermostat in the living room is busted," she demanded, rubbing her arms furiously. "It is freezing out there. You need to call someone to fix it right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth seeping into my palms. "The thermostat works perfectly fine. Sloane, I keep it set to 54 degrees. Her eyes bugged out of her head. 54. We're going to freeze to death. It's the optimal temperature for this specific orchid species' winter dormancy," I explained, gesturing to the rows of greenery behind the glass partition. "If I bump up the heat, it ruins the blooming cycle. These plants are my priority right now." Holden trudged in, looking exhausted. "Mom, seriously, it's freezing. Can't we just crash in your room? You could take the sofa, you have better circulation than we do." I just stared at him, not a blink. My own flesh and blood, suggesting his 65-year-old mother sleep on a lumpy, freezing piece of foam in her own home. It didn't even hurt anymore. It was just absolute, crystal clear validation of exactly who he had become. "My bedroom has a biometric fingerprint lock," I said, holding up my right hand. "And nobody else is in the system. If you're chilly, I suggest you head down to town and buy some thermal layers. There's a fantastic outdoor gear shop about 3 miles down the road." Sloane clenched her jaw. "This is ridiculous. We are your guests." "Your uninvited drop-ins," I corrected her, polishing off my coffee and standing up to rinse the mug. "And in this house, the plants dictate the weather." I left them standing there in the kitchen, trembling with a mix of cold and sheer rage. Later that afternoon, I caught Sloane hovering around the thermostat panel, but I just smiled to myself. I had locked it with a master passcode on my smartphone ages ago. By day 3, my unwelcome tenant's stomach started calling the shots. Sloane had always been the type to expect silver platter service. Back in the day, I'd slave away in the kitchen for hours, trying to win her over with my best recipes. Those days were long gone. I came back from my morning hike to find Sloane aggressively rummaging through my kitchen cabinets. "Where do you hide the actual food?" she snapped, skipping right over "good morning." "All I see is plain oatmeal, cheap sandwich bread, and generic canned tuna. We need a real breakfast. Holden's craving those loaded breakfast skillets you used to make." I walked over to the far end of the kitchen, where I'd installed a massive, commercial-grade walk-in fridge and a solid oak pantry. I pulled a small keypad from my pocket, punched in a pin, and a satisfying click echoed as the heavy door unlatched. Sloane's eyes lit up when she saw the inside-aged Gruyere, prime cuts of steak, fresh berries, and all the high-end ingredients she felt entitled to. I pulled out exactly 2 farm-fresh eggs, a wedge of cheddar, and a single slice of sourdough. Then, I shoved the heavy door shut, letting the auto lock engage with a heavy metallic clunk. "What are you doing?" Sloane demanded, stepping toward the fridge. "Why do you have a padlock on the food? Groceries up here cost an arm and a leg, and I meal prep strictly for my own diet," I answered, casually turning on the stove. "The food in the unlocked cabinets is for you. Oatmeal, filtered water, and tuna. It's nutritious, and the price is right free." Holden wandered in, lured by the smell of butter hitting my skillet. "Mom, that smells incredible. Are you making enough for us?" I slid my perfectly cooked eggs onto a ceramic plate. "The tuna's on the second shelf. Holden. The can opener is in the top drawer." Sloane crossed her arms, scowling. "You're deliberately starving us. You have plenty of money, and you're feeding us doomsday rations." "If the complimentary menu isn't to your liking, Aspen has plenty of 5-star restaurants downtown," I suggested, taking a delightful bite of my breakfast. "Course, you'll have to pay for those with your own money." The sound of Sloane slamming the cabinet doors shut made for excellent breakfast ambiance. The tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. But I stuck to my routine. When I moved up to the mountains, one of my first splurges was a heavy-duty 4x4 truck, fully winterized for the snow. I usually left the keys hanging in plain sight by the mudroom. That morning, Holden approached me with a tight, forced smile. It was the exact same good boy grin he used to flash in high school right before asking to borrow cash. "Mom, Sloane and I want to go check out downtown Aspen, hit the shops, maybe grab a bite. Can I borrow the keys to your truck?" I unhooked the fob from my pocket and handed it over without a word. Holden looked a bit thrown by how easy it was, but he snatched them up and bolted for the door. "Sloane, let's go." I settled into my reading chair by the bay window and waited. I heard the garage bay doors roll up, then the sound of doors slamming as they hopped in. A few seconds later, the starter clicked It choked, sputtered, and failed miserably. The sad grinding noise repeated 3 more times. 10 minutes later, Holden stomped back inside, his face flushed red. "The truck won't start. Mom, I think the battery is completely dead." I set my book face down on my side table. Oh, what a shame. This mountain cold is just brutal on engines. "Well, call a mechanic to come jump it," Sloane barked, poking her head in from the hallway, already dressed in a knockoff designer parka. "We can't just be stranded up here. Mechanics are backed up for weeks during peak ski season." I lied without batting an eyelash. The weather had absolutely nothing to do with it. Hours before they'd even woken up. I'd popped the hood, disconnected the main battery cable, and slipped a crucial ignition fuse into my coat pocket. That truck wasn't going anywhere. "So how are we supposed to get down to town?" Holden asked, real panic setting in. I pointed toward the end of the driveway. "The county bus runs along the main highway. The stop is about 2 miles down the hill. I'd suggest you get stepping." Sloane looked down at her heeled boots, then out at the foot of fresh snow on the driveway, and actually had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. I knew Sloane's patience was running on fumes and that she'd pull something desperate soon. This visit was never about reconnecting as a family. They were here to secure their financial future without having to lift a finger for it. One afternoon, while they thought I was knee-deep in fertilizer at the far end of the greenhouse, I slipped quietly back into the main house. Walking past the hallway, I noticed the door to my home office cracked open. I stopped and watched. Sloane was hunched over my desk, frantically rifling through my drawers. She had one of my filing folders open and was speed-reading the documents inside. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just leaned casually against the doorframe, watching her face morph from intense focus to sheer confusion, and finally, to absolute horror. Instead of finding my actual bank statements, property deeds, or my real will, Sloane was reading a stack of pamphlets I'd printed out and planted in a folder boldly labeled Vital Financial Documents. The brochures heavily detailed the process of taking out a reverse mortgage, meaning the bank would claim the house the second I passed along with a drafted, fake will that left every single penny of my estate to a Grey Wolf Conservation Foundation. I had even scrawled notes in the margins with my own pen. "Make absolutely sure family cannot contest this." Sloane dropped the folder like it was on fire. I took a step forward, purposely letting the hardwood floorboards squeak. She jumped out of her skin and spun around, looking for something specific. "Sloane," I asked, my voice smooth and level. I was just looking for a pen to write something down," she stammered, backing away from the desk. I walked over to the wastebasket, fished out a cheap, chewed-up promotional pen, and handed it to her. "Here you go. By the way, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mix up my donation paperwork. I'm just finalizing the last few details of my legacy." She took the pen, her hands literally shaking. "Everything. To the wolves. They're fascinating creatures." I smiled pleasantly. "And unlike some people, they know better than to encroach on someone else's territory." I watched her gulp hard before she practically sprinted out of the office. The whispered arguments in the living room that night were more frantic than ever. Despite her frustration over my finances, Sloane pivoted to a new tactic. If she couldn't get her hands on my cash, she was going to use my house to fake some social status and network with the locals. One morning, she announced with a haughty air that she had invited 3 local Aspen couples over for a dinner party. Supposedly, They were tech investors and gallery owners she'd met at some Freetown mixer. "I hope you don't mind, Cora," she said, arranging wine glasses on the dining table, the only piece of real furniture I hadn't swapped out for potting stations. "I told them this is our vacation home and that you're just staying with us for a bit while you downsize." The sheer audacity was almost impressive. I didn't argue. I just gave her a slight nod. "It's your party. Sloan, you handle everything." She spent the entire afternoon cooking an extravagant meal she'd clearly put on an already maxed-out credit card. At 6:30 p.m., exactly 30 minutes before her fancy guests were scheduled to arrive, the deep rumble of a heavy diesel engine shook the driveway. Sloan peeked out the window and gasped in horror. A massive commercial dump truck backed right up to the front porch. I threw on my coat, stepped out to sign the driver's clipboard, and gave him a thumbs up. With a deafening roar, 3 metric tons of organic fertilizer, pure, unadulterated manure poured out, completely blocking the main walkway. The pungent, eye-watering stench hit the mountain air instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" Sloan shrieked, running out onto the porch, pinching her nose with a cloth napkin. "Plant food," I replied, casually adjusting my gardening gloves. "Delivery was scheduled for today. Your guests will have to use the back entrance by the dumpsters, but fair warning, it's going to take a few days for that smell to air out." At 7 o'clock on the dot, 3 luxury SUVs pulled up. The drivers took one look at the steaming mountain of manure, caught a whiff of the air, and didn't even bother rolling down their windows. They just threw their cars in reverse and sped off. Sloan was left standing in the doorway, her fancy cocktail dress ruined by the stench of defeat. The dinner party disaster completely shattered whatever polite facade they had left. The next day, the vibe in the house was downright toxic. Holden cornered me in the kitchen. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. Sleeping on a rock-hard couch in 50-degree weather was taking its toll. "Mom, we need to have a serious talk," he said, physically blocking my path to the coffee maker. "Sloan and I are in a really tight spot financially. We need capital. We want to start a consulting firm, but we don't have the seed money. Since you're planning on giving everything away to wild animals anyway, the least you can do is give us an advance on our inheritance. $50,000. It's pocket change for you." I looked at him. Years ago, that speech would have triggered a wave of maternal guilt. Today, all I saw was a grown man allergic to an honest day's work. I opened the kitchen drawer, pulled out a thick canvas apron and a pair of heavy-duty work gloves, and shoved them directly into his chest. "What is this?" he asked, looking confused. "An opportunity," I replied. "I need someone to scrub out the irrigation filters and haul 20 bags of soil. It's backbreaking work and it'll take you about 12 hours. I pay $15 an hour, which is a fair wage for manual labor." Holden dropped the apron on the floor like it was contagious. "I'm your son. I'm not some day laborer you can pay pennies to scrub mud." I calmly picked up the apron. "Money is earned. Holden, you don't want capital. You want an ATM that doesn't ask questions. That option is no longer on the table." "You can't treat us like this," Sloan yelled from the living room sofa. "We demand a little respect. Respect is earned just like a paycheck." I threw back, turning away from them. "By the way, you just lost your hot water privileges. I need the water pressure to power wash the greenhouse tonight." I left them trying to process the reality of taking ice-cold showers. The final showdown was brewing, and I was more than ready for it. Later that afternoon, Sloane decided verbal jabs weren't cutting it anymore. Seething over the manure and the hot water, she decided to make a play for the only normal space left in the house. While I was pruning down in the east wing, I heard a loud thud echoing from the main hallway. I walked softly and caught Sloane dragging a heavy cardboard box toward the back door. I walked over and took a look. She had completely cleared off a small alcove shelf where I kept a collection of antique Mexican pottery my mother had passed down to me. They didn't take up much space, but they were priceless to me. "They're in the way," Sloane sneered defiantly, gripping a hand-painted vase. "I'm going to use this space to store my winter coats. If you're going to treat us like prisoners, we're at least going to have room for our stuff." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to wrestle the vase away from her. I just nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. "You believe that the space my belongings occupy in my own house can just be replaced by yours." I turned on my heel and walked right back to my workspace. Sloane looked almost disappointed that I hadn't exploded into a screaming match, but she smugly went back to boxing up my things. What she didn't realize was that I didn't need to shout to enforce my boundaries. I waited until Holden and Sloane left a couple of hours later. They had decided to trek down to the local gas station for junk food, entirely sick of eating canned tuna. The second they were out of sight, I grabbed a roll of heavy-duty industrial trash bags. I marched over to the pull-out couch and methodically packed up every single thing they owned. Her designer labels, their overpriced skincare, his fancy boots. I didn't break or ruin a single item. I just packed it all up with ruthless efficiency. Once I was done, I hauled the bags and suitcases out the back door and stacked them neatly inside the woodshed. In the backyard, an uninsulated, drafty lean-to fully exposed to the bitter mountain winds. It was time to close this chapter, with the living room finally purged of their luggage. I grabbed my toolbox. Swapping out a deadbolt cylinder is a piece of cake if you have the right parts. And I always kept a spare set for emergencies. In under 15 minutes, I had entirely changed the front door lock and bolted all the rear access points from the inside. Then, I brewed a nice cup of chamomile tea, sank into my armchair, and waited. By 5 o'clock, the sun was dipping below the peaks and the temperature was plummeting fast. I saw Holden and Sloane trudging up the driveway, hugging themselves against the bitter cold, clutching plastic bags full of chips. Holden pulled out the spare key I'd given him on day one and jammed it into the door. He turned it, but the mechanism instantly jammed. He frowned, pulled it out, and tried again, shoving his shoulder against the heavy wood. "The key's not catching," I heard him mutter through the glass. Sloane shoved him aside. "Let me do it." She tried to force it, then started pounding her fists against the door. "Cora, open the door. This stupid thing is stuck." I stood up, walked over to the front porch window, and cracked it open just a couple of inches, just enough for my voice to carry into the freezing air. "The lock isn't stuck," I said calmly. "It's brand new." Holden took a step back, looking pale. "What are you talking about?" "Let us in. Mom, your stay has been terminated," I replied. I slipped a white envelope through the narrow gap in the window and let it drop onto the porch floor. "There's an itemized invoice for your lodging, cleaning fees, and utilities. Your bags are safe and sound out in the woodshed behind the house." Sloane completely lost her mind, screaming into the wind. "You can't do this to us. It's freezing. This is inhumane. It is my property," I said, my pulse barely even elevated. "You don't have a lease. You don't have a key. And you don't have an invitation. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear your junk out of my shed before I set the automatic sprinklers to go off. Have a good night." I slammed the window shut and threw the steel latch. From the warmth of my living room, I watched the grand finale play out on my security monitors. Sloan and Holden kept banging on the door for another couple of minutes. But the biting Aspen wind was a lot more persuasive than their anger. Once they saw the main lights in my house click off, they finally realized I was absolutely dead serious. I watched them drag their feet toward the backyard shed. Sloane's expensive luggage was now dusted with a fine layer of sawdust. They had to haul everything down the pitch-black driveway, dragging those tiny wheels through the snow, heading toward the highway to beg for a ride back to town. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. The role of the unconditional, doormat mother was a part I'd stopped playing a long time ago. The next morning, the sun was blindingly bright against the pristine mountain snow. I made myself a proper breakfast, perfect over-easy eggs, thick toast, and freshly ground coffee. No one complained about the smell. No one demanded to be served, and no one invaded my peace and quiet. I strolled into the east wing, feeling the warm, humid air of the greenhouse instantly relax my shoulders. My orchids were right on the verge of blooming, and the silence in my home was absolute perfection. My neighbor, a sweet, older guy named Silas, waved to me from his property line while I was watering the plants near the glass. I waved back with a genuine, effortless smile. I had built my life with my own 2 hands, and I wasn't about to let anyone waltz in and claim the fruits of my labor. At 65, I was finally the undeniable master of my own time and space. I'd learned the hard way that setting ironclad boundaries is the only real way to protect the things you love. Peace of mind, I found, costs about the exact same amount as a brand new set of deadbolts. And it was worth every single penny.